Okay, everybody, it's story time. We're going to talk about the single biggest threat to Canadian national unity in my lifetime, at least, in the last 20 to 30 years, to be exact. The last time things were this bad was when Quebec was almost separated in a referendum. Actually, in my view, the referendum probably did result in Quebec voting to separate, and they just rigged the polls or otherwise fiddled with it because it was less than 1%, so yeah. Anyway, so before we get into the Trans Mountain Pipeline, let's talk a little bit about Canada. Let's give a little background, because not everybody who watches these videos knows anything about my homeland. Okay, so this is Canada. So we have Ontario and Quebec, where the vast majority of Canada's population lives. We have the East Coast, which is rather poor and not many people live there. Then we have Western Canada. British Columbia is an immensely wealthy province. Alberta is a boom or bust province. Alberta has an immense amount of oil. Depending on how you count oil reserves, Canada actually has some of the largest oil reserves on Earth. And most of that is in Alberta, although a lot of it is also in Saskatchewan, and there's a fair amount of it also within Newfoundland and Labrador. So kind of one of the ongoing contentious points between the different parts of Canada is equalization. Some provinces are classified as have provinces, and some provinces are classified as have-nots. Generally speaking, British Columbia and Ontario are have provinces, and the rest of Canada is periodically have-not. I think Quebec's always been have-not. The East Coast has always been. Newfoundland, I think, is a have now because of oil. And Alberta goes back and forth. So there is a lot of resentment there. Ontario kind of resents the rest of the country because it's something like 35 to 40% of the population and was traditionally the economic engine that kind of subsidized Quebec and Eastern Canada. Alberta, like I said, is a boom and bust province, so sometimes it was getting subsidized, sometimes it wasn't. And British Columbia just always has been doing pretty well. More or less from what I can recall. But Ontario really, and I know just because I live here, there's a lot of resentment that we feel like a lot of the rest of Canada is freeloading, because that's where most of the industry used to be. That's where Toronto is the financial hub of the country, etc. So what happened during the 1980s is this was in the aftermath of the oil crisis. Prices were rising. We had a socialist government under Justin Trudeau. Sorry, not Justin Trudeau, his father. And Petro-Canada was formed, which was basically Canada's nationalized oil industry. Petro-Can still exists, but it was sold off. I forget if it was Royal Dutch Shell or someone who bought it, but it's not owned by the government anymore. So oil was basically nationalized, and the idea was going to be that oil from Alberta and well, I don't think oil was found in Saskatchewan yet, would be sent east to subsidize Ontario and Quebec, or something to that effect. The details don't really matter. The point is that the impression was that Alberta was giving its oil to Eastern Canada because Eastern Canada was in trouble. Now, for Ontario's part, our perspective is, well, we've been subsidizing Alberta and all the other provinces for years. It's time that we get our some payback. It's time that they give us some of their resources in trade. But Alberta didn't feel that way. And they were very angry about the whole thing. And ultimately, the Modern Conservative Party, which was the Reform Party and the Alliance Party, resulted in the Western Canadian branch of the Conservative Party breaking off, in a large part due to the legacy of the National Energy Program and the general belief that Western Canada's needs weren't being met, and that Ontario and Quebec just got everything, because Ontario and Quebec together are more than 50% of Canada's population. I think Quebec is about 25 and Ontario is like 36, 37, something like that. So they have a majority of the vote between these two provinces. And so a party needs to either pander to one or both in order to gain power, whereas the West was largely, and to a large extent still is, an afterthought. So Alberta felt angry about that, and they developed the bumper sticker which said, "Let the Eastern bastard freeze in the dark." So the National Energy Program eventually was kaput. It kind of collapsed. Alberta kind of went back to the way it always was. So then, kind of in the aftermath of 9/11 and throughout the 2000s, oil prices continued to rise. And Alberta was suddenly awash with immense amounts of money. Saskatchewan, too, which had historically been one of the poorest provinces, that combined with Saskatchewan finally threw out the NDP, who were our socialist party. I think the NDP was in power for like 30 or 40 years or something. And they elected a conservative government who dramatically liberalized the economy. So a combination of that, oil prices, more efficient agricultural techniques. Saskatchewan went into a boom, and it's still booming to this day as far as I know. Alberta, though, the government became fantastically wealthy more or less overnight. Income taxes were extremely low in Alberta. In Alberta, charitable donations were, you got a 50% refund on charitable donations. There's no sales tax, etc. The government even had prosperity checks that they used to send out to the people. Now, they saved a little bit of the money in a prosperity fund, but the government basically used it as an opportunity to just spend on literally everything they could possibly spend on. And obviously, this is my Eastern Canadian perspective coming in here, but I feel like they were very irresponsible with the oil money, and it's kind of all gone. And once it was kind of, they called them blue-eyed sheiks after the Persian Gulf states. But anyway, so that all happened, and recently, a couple of years ago, the price of a barrel of oil rapidly fell. It didn't affect gas prices, but it meant that Alberta's oil was suddenly worth a lot less. And Alberta's oil comes from the oil sands, which is a little different from like what Saudi Arabia has. My understanding is Saudi Arabian oil is pressurized, so it literally like spurts out of the ground. Whereas in Alberta, you have to go through this long, complicated, expensive process of getting it out of the oil sands. And that's only financially viable if the barrels of oil are really expensive. So when the price fell, Alberta was in huge trouble. The oil was not really worth what it would cost to extract it. The economy was overly dependent upon it. I think like the example I always give is Fort McMurray, which was a town that was built up solely for oil and gas extraction. And you could get paid like $25 an hour or whatever to deliver pizzas. Plus they'd give you a free pizza per shift. And that wasn't enough to live there. And just people from Eastern Canada, and I'm getting way off topic, but there's a thing in the States called the locusts, where people from blue states who have destroyed the blue states move to red states because they're lower tax and the economy is doing better. And then they vote for the same policies that destroyed their home states. And that's why Virginia is now a blue state, because of the locusts moving there from the Northeast. And that happened to Alberta as a result of the boom. Is liberals from like Eastern Canada moved there, and they started to become a substantial percentage of the population. And that's partially why the NDP won in Alberta. But once again, we're getting off track. So anyways, overnight, Alberta's economy collapsed. Drug use, in particular opiate usage, has gone through the roof in Alberta. Crime is surging. The whole thing is a complete mess. The province is not in a good state. So now oil prices are starting to go back up again, and Alberta's in a position to kind of recoup some of the money it lost. The problem is Canada's pipeline system was built during the 1950s, I think it was. Let's move over to this that's the wrong one. Let's scroll down. I'm sorry for this. Okay, so yeah, it was built during the 1950s, and it was expanded in 1957. I don't think it's been expanded since 1957. No, it hasn't. The pipeline that Alberta is using to export its oil has not been expanded, from my understanding, since the 1950s. And obviously, they found a lot more oil, and production has really been ramped up. So Alberta was approached by a company in the States called Kinder Morgan, and they're like, we want to build a bigger pipeline so you can export more oil into British Columbia, and then we can ship the oil overseas to East Asia at a higher price to help make China economy strong. And Alberta will make a bunch of money, and you'll get out of this financial hole, and you can start rebuilding. So let's go into the timeline. So that was kind of the background. Everybody at the time thought this was awesome. It was going to be a private organization. It was going to create jobs. They were going to share the revenue with both governments. There'd be all kinds of money made. The federal government thought this was a great idea. So let's go in and let's look at the timeline and let's see like what happened and how this all went wrong. So let's see here. So there was an oil spill in the Edmonton area where nearly 10,000 barrels of oil were released, which actually doesn't really sound like that much when you consider a barrel of oil. Environmentalists are stupid. Like, the thing is, are oil spills bad? Yes. But, I mean, is it really worse to have, for the environment, to have a pipeline than to have, because, I mean, the oil is going to be transported regardless because people need it. Is it really better to have, like, these giant trucks take the oil instead of have a pipeline? Because the trucks are a lot less energy efficient. I'm pretty sure that generates a lot more greenhouse gases than pumping it. I'm sure you can pump it using electricity generated from renewable sources. Like, the electricity that powers the pump line could come from, like, windmills or something. Plus, isn't there, like, a much higher percent... Like, because you only have spills from pipelines, like, once every couple decades or something. It's not very common, whereas trucks crash all the time. But we aren't here to try to figure out the way environmentalists think. So there was a bit of an expansion of the pipeline. They built some more stuff in, and that increased the capacity from 260,000 barrels per day to 300,000 barrels per day. So Alberta was approached by Kinder Morgan, a American pipeline oil and gas company, and they said, look, we want to expand the Trans Mountain pipeline. We want to build infrastructure in BC so you can ship the oil overseas. Everybody's going to get rich off of this. Alberta is suffering an economic crisis. At the time, British Columbia was governed by the BC Liberal Party. Now, BC is kind of different than the rest of Canada, politically speaking, because in Western Canada, the Liberal Party historically has had very little influence, because farmers will either vote socialist or conservative. Cosmopolitan liberals don't really have anything to offer them. And in British Columbia, the Conservative Party and the Liberal Party merged to form the Liberal Party. So they call themselves the Free Market Coalition, and their main thing is to be pro-business. So they thought this sounded like a great idea. Okay, we can bring more oil and gas. The oil and gas will be cheaper for British Columbians. We'll get all this additional ship traffic. This is going to be great. So they were on board. Kinder Morgan was on board, and Alberta was on board. Obviously, Alberta's going to be on board. So they applied to the National Energy Board with a proposal to expand the pipeline in 2017, with the aim of having the oil flow through the expansion by 2019. Okay, so that's lots of time to approve it. They can go through and do whatever the stupid environmental studies that they want to do. Okay, so almost immediately we have protests. Oh, wait a minute, that's a full year later. So more than 100 people are arrested after they camp out in a conservation area on Burnaby Mountain east of Vancouver to block crews from conducting drilling and survey work related to the pipeline expansion. Most of the charges are later dropped. And you just had people go apeshit over this whole thing. People went completely nuts over this pipeline. They're saying, like, this is evil, this is the worst thing ever. Everybody involved with this is bad. What about Aboriginal groups? Why aren't the Aboriginal groups being consulted about this? And you have to understand this happens all the time in Canada. The Aboriginals complain about everything. Even when they get huge sums of money from the companies, like the government and the companies will give them huge amounts of money to extract resources on their land. But they tend to irresponsibly blow through it like crazy and then complain that they weren't given more money. That's what happened in Apawataskat, but that's it's a tale for another time. So we have a, let's see here, National Energy Board postpones hearings after striking from the record economic evidence. Okay, I thought this not very interesting. So this is kind of interesting. So the NDP government in Alberta is pragmatic enough to realize we can't be anti-oil and gas. We may be the Socialist Party, but our province's economy is based on oil. So they continue to fight for the pipeline. So the new premier of Alberta said the pipeline expansion is in the best interest of Alberta and Canada. And when the new Liberal government came to power, they said that they're going to fix things up. There's going to be assessed as part of greenhouse gas emissions. Is it going to be safe? We're also going to have to consult more with First Nations because they're pussies. Ottawa, so they appointed a 3-member panel to conduct it. So the National Energy Board recommended approval of the pipeline. Once again, this whole process took 3 years. Everyone had 3 years to put all their input in, to do the environmental impact, for First Nations groups to talk about it. Alberta had agreed to it. The federal government agreed to it. Justin Trudeau, the like granola crunching hippie himself, gave personal approval to it. Provided that they follow certain conditions which they agreed to do. So the government of BC immediately signed on, passed legislation, said Kinder Morgan had agreed all of the stuff, and they had given the government of BC $1 billion. I mean, that's great. That's just free money. They don't have to get... Plus, there's all the taxes they'll pay. There's the cheaper oil and gas. It's going to be great for BC. So... let's see here. So then the Notley's government files a bunch of lawsuits, is fighting First Nations who are trying to block the project. So Kinder Morgan has decided they're going to invest $7.4 billion into the pipeline. That's going to be $7.4 billion injected into Canada's economy. I mean, this is a great opportunity. So this is when everything starts to become a disaster. So... in British Columbia, not only are the Liberals removed from power, but the NDP come to power in a coalition with the Green Party. And they decide to immediately tear up the agreement, get rid of it. They're going to go back on it. Okay, so maybe we already signed a legally binding agreement and everybody was on board and construction had started, but that doesn't matter. We have to appease our base. So this starts going, the BC government starts to fund the people who are attacking the Alberta government over the whole thing. Let's see here. So the BC government starts to deny Kinder Morgan stuff to get municipal permits, just trying to stonewall them as much as possible. The National Energy Board just allows them to go ahead with it. The Trans Mountain expansion is at least a year behind schedule. Let's see here. So the BC government has starts to engage in a trade war against Alberta to try and force Alberta into compliance. So they restrict any increase in oil until it conducts more spill response studies. And this is a move that dramatically will slow down or stop the pipeline process. So that the BC Supreme Court, everything just keeps going crazier and crazier. There's a trade war that goes on between Alberta and British Columbia over this whole thing. So like let's go through and let's look at this article. British Columbia was just trying to stonewall this whole thing. So Alberta had imposed a ban on importing wine from British Columbia because British Columbia was trying to stonewall them by banning oil imports. So we have a trade war going on within Canada, two provinces that are next to each other, and they're having a trade war. It's madness. And the BC government has ripped up the agreement, even though it had previously gotten approval. The BC government itself had legally agreed to it. The whole thing is just like becoming an increasing disaster. So then Alberta threatened to just cut off all exports of oil to BC and lead them to have a total energy crisis. So all this stuff was just going on. Kinder Morgan basically suspended construction at this point and was about to pull out because the whole thing is just a mess, and they don't know if the pipeline's going to be built. They don't know if the BC government's going to let them build it. They don't know if First Nations protesters are going to blow it up. They don't know what's going on. So Justin Trudeau during this whole thing has taken a mildly pro-pipeline standpoint because he had approved it and he kind of had to stand by it. But he just was kind of ineffectually going, okay, well, maybe we need the pipeline, but I also like First Nations, and I like BC, and I like the environment. So he was just completely weak and ineffective over this whole thing. So, he had agreed to the pipeline, and the pipeline not being built at this point would be a total disaster for the country's economy, as well as his political reputation. So he came up with the genius plan of nationalizing the Trans Mountain Pipeline, which he bought from it. He paid $4.4 billion of taxpayers' money to buy the pipeline that was already being built with with private money that was actually going to give $1 billion to the governments of BC and Alberta. So that's like a $5 or $6 billion deficit there. So they eventually want to sell it off and make it a crown corporation in the meantime, etc. So the government of BC said, okay, so the federal government has purchased this pipeline. We're still going to keep fighting it. And then the nuclear bomb dropped. By the way, just before we get to the nuclear bomb. So when the federal government announced they were nationalizing the pipeline, Quebec issued a really strong statement lambasting the federal government, saying this is tyranny. This was an imposition of federal power. Justin Trudeau was acting like a mad tyrant. And Quebec started to talk about independence again itself and starting to threaten it over what they saw as an overreach of federal power. So meanwhile, as everything's falling apart, the Federal Court of Appeal overturned the government's approval of the project. So the appeal, the approval that was given, how long ago was this? Let me just bring this up, sorry. This is, that was given back in 2016, was overturned 3 years later after they started building, 2 years later after they started building the damn pipeline. So Kinder Morgan just sold the pipeline to the federal government. They said they're not going to invest in Canada anymore. And why would they invest in Canada anymore? Why would anyone invest in Canada after this disaster? Because, I keep stressing this. The British Columbian government, the Alberta government, the federal government, the company, everybody had agreed to this. And the court's statement was there hadn't been enough environmentalist impact and First Nations hadn't been consulted enough. Well, how much consultation are they supposed to give? How much power are these randoids supposed to have over our economy? And obviously Alberta was not happy about this because they were kind of depending on this and they had spent all this time and money to get it going. So this led to the leader of the Conservative Party, Jason Kenney, who is a very ardent Canadian nationalist and is known for being a very ardent Canadian nationalist. So he said, I would not be surprised if a significant and growing minority of Albertans are entertaining thoughts of separatism. I'm a Canadian nationalist, and by the way, separating ourselves from the rest of the country is not how we're going to get market access, but people are very frustrated. So the frustration boiled over after a federal court of appeal reversed a cabinet decision to allow the Trans Mountain construction to go ahead, citing insufficient consultation with Indigenous people and a failure to consider the impact of increased tanker traffic. The court indefinitely halted the pipeline's construction. So why is anyone ever going to invest in Canada again after this? I wouldn't invest in Canada because this might happen. This is the kind of shit that happens in North Korea, or I'd say China, but the Chinese government isn't this stupid. They want foreign investment. If you have no control over, if there's no laws protecting private property, if it can just be seized by the government like it is in this case, then why would you invest in the country? So let's see here. If we can't get market access and we can't get this pipeline built, I would be prepared to hold a referendum on equalization. That is, Alberta will refuse to do any subsidies to the less wealthy provinces. And he said, I think that's Alberta's ultimate leverage in the federation. And that would force binding negotiations with the federal government. Alberta pays a significant amount of money to the fund and received nothing from it. And he said, I would just stop paying them until they let us just have this pipeline built. And it's a disaster. So Alberta's talking about secession. Quebec's pissed off. BC is angry. Everybody's pissed at Justin Trudeau because he didn't take either side. He played a compromise in the traditional ineffective way that he's prone to. So I hope that kind of explains the Trans Mountain Pipeline thing, what the controversy is, what caused it.